A história da arte sem homens, de Katy Hessel, não exclui os homens, apenas faz justiça a uma quantidade enorme de mulheres que foram ignoradas ao longo dos séculos. Chegou a hora de as conhecermos e de compreendermos o tanto que elas contribuíram para a história da arte e que muito do que fizeram e do que se criou na história da arte não tinha existido sem elas. A História da Arte Sem Homens é uma edição da Objetiva. Hi, Katy. Thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to meet you. You studied art history. When did you notice that women were not included in what you have been learning when you were studying?
Well, it actually came after I had been studying already. So it was just after I finished university. I walked into an art fair in London nearly 9 years ago to the day. And I looked around me and I realised that I didn't see a single artwork by a woman artist. And what shocked me most was when I asked myself, could I name 20 women artists off the top of my head? And the answer was no. Had I essentially been looking at art history from a male perspective, the answer was yes. And so I was 21 years old. What do you do when you're that age? You have an internet connection, you look up on Instagram if there's anything you can do to learn about this, because none of the books that I had focused on women artists. None of the courses that I studied focused on that. So I turned to the internet and I began an account mainly for myself to put my knowledge to good use and to say to myself, okay, every single day, find a woman artist and write something about her on Instagram. And I didn't intend for it to become, you know, the platform that it has become. But what's amazing about it is that clearly so many other people are hungry for these stories. And the amazing thing about the internet is the fact that everyone can be part of it and everyone can follow along and be included in this exciting progression in history.
So it always depends on who tells the story, because what you've learned in school and in the university, and also in books, you couldn't figure out any work of women artists. But when you try to search it for yourself and to your own knowledge, you could find it. But did you find it in the museums?
Well, it's interesting. There are books out there that specialise in this, and I stand on the shoulders of incredible feminist scholars who have done so much work to put their names into the mainstream. The museum question is an interesting one, because that's one of my tools to research. What I do is I go to a museum and I look at every single gallery label and I see if there's a woman, I write it down, maybe take a picture, and then go home and research it that day. And actually, as a result, I've started making audio guides for the Met, the Tate, all sorts of museums around the world, seeking out those artworks by women, because perhaps not necessarily you might not know that they are by a woman. You know, there's this great moment in my tour for the Met, in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, where we're in this room in their European galleries in the 19th century, and we're full of these kind of very sensual female nudes. And then on one wall, taking up the entire wall, is a giant painting of a horse fair. This is by an artist called Rosa Bonheur in the 1840s, 1850s. And women didn't have access to the life room where they could study the nude figure from life until way later in the 1800s. So they turned to subjects such as themselves, or in the case of Rosa Bonheur, animal painting. And so you see this extraordinary painting in front of you. It's almost like being at the theatre, watching all these horses gallop around this mound in Paris. And actually, the only way that Rosa Bonheur was even able to capture that scene was because she got a licence from the French police saying that she could wear trousers. So she had to disguise herself as that. But what I mean is that you might not necessarily know that women also made these giant paintings. And so going to museums and seeking out these stories is a very effective way of finding out about women.
One thing that was very shocking for me to know when I was reading the book was that some movements and some techniques were actually the pioneers, the people who find out about them were women and not men. And we actually know their names, the man names, but we don't know about her or the artist, the women artist. This is very strange because we can't really tell the story right until we know their work, the women's work.
Well, I think that's why it's necessary for me to have written this book. I didn't want to write this book in the sense that there should be no need for it, but we live in a world where there is. And so, you know, take something like solarization, which is a photographic technique that in the history books that I read growing up told me that Man Ray invented those techniques. It's a sort of his silvery kind of series of photographs, but actually it was just as much Lee Miller, perhaps more Lee Miller than him, who helped develop that technique, yet her name is so often omitted from history. Yet she had one of the most extraordinary careers in history. You know, born in the early 1900s, she became a model first for Vogue, having bumped into Condé Nast on the zebra crossing in New York City. Life took her to Paris, where she did work with Man Ray, then back to New York during the Great Depression, where she changed her name from Elizabeth to Lee because she wanted to be a commercial photographer. Then she went to Egypt and then finally ended up in Britain, where she ended up as a war correspondent for British Vogue for the Second World War. And you just think this is one of the most extraordinary, diverse, exciting, wide-ranging careers in art history, yet she's so often reduced to Man Ray's muse, when actually not only did she help him develop these pioneering techniques, but also had such an incredible career herself.
Yes, and I was looking at a picture by Marlowe Moss, and this is also a strange episode in the art history, because if we see this painting of Marlowe Moss, we immediately think about Mondrian.
Yeah. I mean, you know, I think it's about also saying that there were so many women and men working at the same time, corresponding, and they were influencing each other. It's not ever to say that, you know, women artists are better than male artists. It's just to say that they were there and they were pioneering, just as pioneering. And it's about, you know, what you're saying, it's about how do we actually tell that story? And if the story we keep telling ourselves and the one that gets written about and written about and written about is the male, the male, the male, then not only are we missing out on great art, but we're just not going to look at something from truth at the end of the day. And actually, you weaken your knowledge of art history as well, because it's so important to have different points of view in life. Because not that I think there's anything inherently different about art created by different genders, but the way it's been written has been different because, you know, this book is called The Story of Art Without Men, which is a very much tongue-in-cheek title, but it's based on a book called The Story of Art by E.H. Gombrich, which, when it was first published in 1950, included 0 women artists. And it was a book I read growing up, and only in its 16th edition did it include just one, that being Käthe Kollwitz, the great German expressionist. And so, you know, if the story of art is essentially the story of art without women, then we need to, first of all, have the story of art without men, but question, why are some narratives the default? And once we kind of get that under our skin, we can start questioning other things, which I believe can lead to a much fairer and exciting society.
Yes, and can we, from this point of view, we can also introduce in the fine arts some other techniques, like you say here in the book, like tapestry and women working with different materials.
Well, exactly, and actually, you know, that idea of eliminating tapestry or embroidery or ceramics or something was a huge issue that I wanted to address in this book as well, in the sense that when the establishment, such as the Royal Academy in London, was set up in 1768, you know, 18 months after they opened, they banned embroidery. But that was the medium that women could access. So in a way, you're almost setting women up to fail and to not be able to access these institutions.
Do you think that was because men couldn't do it?
No, I don't think at all. I think it's just really interesting, this idea of what is seen as high art and what is seen as low art. And I think that, you know, what's extraordinary about textile is that actually when you think about quilting, threading, fibre arts, anything, actually what textile reveals is a deep political subtext and a story from the last 500 years about struggle. And actually what textile allows for is, you know, I mean, if we think about Chile and the Kupu people, when I write about Cecilia
Yes.
Vicuna, who's an extraordinary poet and artist who very much kind of reinterprets that, you know, back in before the 1600s, before the Spanish invasion, they made textile as a form of communication, but it was wiped out by the colonizers. And this idea that this language, through threads, was abolished is, you know, it's an erasure of an identity. And so there are so many different political subtexts when we think about textiles. And it's really extraordinary that now, in today's age, we're really kind of looking at them and we're celebrating them. And they're becoming something of the high art, if that's what we should call it. We are in a moment now where people, especially those in high up positions, have huge influence and they want to see a new art history because, of course, the Titians and the Raphaels, of course, are part of it, and we shouldn't erase them. But that's just one strand of it. It's about saying all these different histories are also present because, like I said, if you don't look beyond what you're taught or that very thin line, then you're just missing out on great art and stories. And I believe that we want as many people as possible to join this art history, not just artists, but the people who work behind the scenes as well. And so I think it's a really exciting time to say, let's all be part of this conversation and we can together we can make a big difference.
Mm-hmm. So it's about equality.
Yeah, it's about inclusivity, equality and progressiveness, and it's exciting.
Yes, and the book you wrote is also very exciting. Thank you so much, Katy. A História da Arte sem Homens é um título provocador para um livro que, no fundo, o que pretende é fazer justiça e mostrar-nos o trabalho de várias mulheres a que não tivemos acesso durante séculos e que agora finalmente estão espalhados pelo mundo em museus, em galerias e também em estudos dedicados à arte feita por mulheres. A edição deste livro é da Objetiva. Thank you, Katy.